بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين صلى الله على سيدنا Muhammad وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to this session 5 of the Story of Riba. As discussed, we've been charting the whole trajectory of Riba, and in part 4 we covered in a very succinct format how the imperative of growth brought about by the joining of the stock markets, the sense of a joint stock company, with the issuance of fiat currency through the backing of a central bank, created a new type of economy, which someone like David Graeber called a war economy. In essence, this imperative for growth led to colonization. Now, we also covered how this growth imperative led to an integration of the markets in the sense of colonization, and these pressures themselves led to further pressures amongst the Western European powers. And so we covered how that led to firstly the First World War. And then it led to the Second World War as a result of the hyperinflation and the debts that were placed primarily on Germany. And in the Weimar Republic, obviously there was a sense of this failure, and so this provided the conditions of that were conducive to the furtherance or the increasing of this far-right fascist rhetoric of Hitler. And so what we said was, post Second World War, obviously there needed to be a change. And if globalization was defined as the rapid integration of markets of commodities, manufacturers, labor, and capital, then this was very much how colonization worked. But in the previous period prior to the Second World War, this process necessitates obviously the removal of any market impediment. And the way that worked during colonization was simple. As Ferguson says, the first era of globalization, now Ferguson says, the first era of globalization had a simple solution to this problem of removing an impediment: impose European rule. So in his book, Niall Ferguson talks about how in 1840, after China's king authorities took issue with the British opium trade that was being conducted in China's southern ports, and they obviously thought that, hang on, this is not right, and they complained, thinking that these were pirates. But the response was the British sent its gunships and basically seized Hong Kong and 5 other treaty ports, including Shanghai. And Hong Kong would then, post that, operate as a series of British possessions, wherein people were treated as British subjects, and it operated through complete immunity from domestic law, from the law of China. And so the imposition, this serves as a model for us to understand that the imposition of colonial rule was itself what made this kind of pattern alluring to overseas investors. Because effectively, to borrow modern parlance, this amounted to a no default guarantee. Because if any of the places would default, then they would come to see that they could always send in their gunships and their armies. And as Ferguson notes, Western financial institutions reach the wider world. So wherever they go, they'd install the same kind of models that they had themselves, either through overt colonialism or through neocolonialism, which was what happened in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire technically were not colonized, but they were colonized through debt, implicitly, by the fact that they were very indebted, especially to Britain and France, especially after the Crimean War. And so this kind of policy then allowed them to impose their own financial institutions. And it's very interesting that the first Ottoman bank finds its headquarters in London, right? And similarly, then this kind of French kind of influence also takes over there. So Ferguson notes that these Western financial institutions come to the wider world as part of the package of Western imperialism. And they are founded on a trinity of sound money, balanced budgets, and quote unquote free trade imposed by imperialism and colonization. And Then they included the rule of law. So what does that mean? Specifically, the British-style property rights. Very interesting. The British would go and, especially in India, they would literally claim property rights on land, but the land wasn't owned by them. So they'd first conquer it, take over the land, and then as part of their ownership of the land, they would deputize or allocate the land to zamindars, people who would be landowners, who would operate as a buffer class between the British ruling elite and the average man in India. So this kind of conquering and creating a divide and rule policy and creating a buffer aristocracy whose job, to borrow parlance, would to be brown sahibs, to be effectively natives, but who are kind of an in-between. And so their job is to keep the natives passive to prevent a large-scale revolt. Now, obviously, this type of colonization as a model, now that Europe itself has imploded by this kind of imperialist rivalry through the First World War, and then most definitely through the Second World War, then this, and just for that information, the First World War was considered the most destructive war the world ever saw. And having imposed that collective order on Germany, the Second World War was also incredibly destructive. And these cyclical tensions now necessitated a different way of managing this kind of globalization, if we take that colonization to be the first wave of globalization. And so this results in 1944, in Bretton Woods, this primarily involved only the US and the UK treasuries, but the idea was to devise a new global financial architecture for the post-war world. And so what they did in 1944, primarily US and UK treasuries, was that they set up, at that time, three major bodies, right? So primarily it was establishing the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, known as IBRD, later would come to be known as the World Bank. Later on, there was to be another major world body established that was known as the World Trade Organization, but that comes well after the Bretton Woods. But in Bretton Woods, there were only two major bodies. There was the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. So while the International Monetary Fund was intended to regulate exchange rates and to provide funds to rebuild countries shattered by war, collectively, the International Monetary Fund, alongside the World Bank, acted as guardians for what was considered the full freedom of cross-border capital movements. And so Niall Ferguson says, in discussing this, he says, colonialism was now being readapted. And so he says, the days had gone when investors could confidently expect their governments to send a gunboat when a foreign government misbehaved. Now the role of financial policing had to be played by two unarmed bankers, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Their new watchword became conditionality. No reforms, no money. Their preferred mechanism was the structural adjustment program. And the policies the debtor countries had to adopt became known as the Washington Consensus, a wish list of 10 economic policies that would have gladdened the heart of a British imperial administrator 100 years before. Now, it's very interesting that when you look at the IMF and the World Bank, we'd think that, okay, this is kind of some kind of world representation. But in reality, it was the representation of the corporate influences of the major countries who were, namely England and America, who were a part of it. So if you look at the IMF and the World Bank, you can easily trace this. Both institutions, IMF and the World Bank, are based in Washington, DC. And although they are owned by supposedly all 184 member countries, they are effectively controlled by just 7. This is what we call the G7 countries, because the G7 countries have a majority, 40% vote. And amongst these G7 countries, the US holds the largest share at 18%. And so US alone has the ability to veto policies within the IMF and the World Bank that do not serve US's interests. Likewise, votes are allocated according to financial strength. So effectively $1, 1 vote. So this results in the financially powerful countries, and namely the commercial interests that influence them, determining the monetary, economic, and development architecture of the global economy. So the IMF and the World Bank would then go on to establish various policies, and they were joined in 1995 by what's known as the World Trade Organization, or WTO, as a multilateral body. And the WTO's explicit aim was to lower tariffs and non-tariff barriers with a view to what? Increase international trade. But collectively, these three institutions, these three multilateral institutions, by multilateral I mean cross-border, would come to affect a situation wherein the growth of money would be maximized for those who already possess it, namely the corporations. And this cannot be lost, because if you were to do a review of the 100 most richest economic entities in the world, the top 50 would be corporations, not countries. And so when we understand this, we'll understand that, and this is what Neil Ferguson says, that colonization was for corporations. Don't forget, the joint stock companies that were running the initial stage of colonization were companies, right? East India Company, East India Dutch Company, the Mississippi Company, the South Sea Company. All of these were companies that were imperialist companies supporting literally colonization projects, so conquering other countries and using their resources, but they were commercially orientated companies whose bottom line was profit. That's what was underlying them. And so if we understand colonization was for corporations, then what really happened post 1944, the so-called new financial architecture? It still remained for corporations. So colonization, I refer to this as colonization take two. And if we find, a lot of people might say, okay, this is anti-globalization and so on. We don't need to look any further than people like the Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, who himself was a chief economist of the World Bank from 1997 to 2000, and a serious economist of the IMF, International Monetary Fund. And he himself says many of the policies that the IMF have pushed, in particular premature capital market liberalization, which is basically opening up the countries to liberalization, that means US can go in and privatize and take over much of Philippines and much of any other companies within these countries, and they can provide the almost like the this kind of this supply for their own trade, but they themselves would protect their own countries from similar liberalization. So Joseph Stiglitz says this has contributed to global instability, whereby the influx of hot money, and what he means by hot money here is the capital of money which is transferred between financial institutions to maximize interest. So the influx of this kind of money, just to get influx or interest or capital gain, goes into and out of a country, just so that it allows for those rich corporations to benefit from the assets and resources of these countries. And this often, Stiglitz says, leaves havoc in its wake, wherein the benefits will only accrue to the well-off, and especially the well-off. Another person who's written a lot about this is David Corton, and he touches upon this by saying that economic globalization policies as enforced by the World Bank and the IMF, and later by the WTO, World Trade Organization, actually have far more to do with creating poverty than solving it. So-called free trade requires that all countries adopt the same economic model, thus eliminating variations that might slow down the smooth global operations of the major corporations as they continually seek new resources, markets, and cheap labor. What is true is that the system has added to the well-being of the corporations that perpetuated it. Now, the corporations themselves obviously push for removal of regulation because it's in their favor, right? And so one of the really interesting comments was made by the late president of Brazil, Luiz Ignacio Silva, who said, instead of soldiers dying, there are children. Instead of millions of wounded, there are millions of unemployed. Instead of destruction of bridges, there is the tearing down of factories, schools, hospitals, and entire economies. It is a war over the foreign debt, one which has as its main weapon interest, a weapon more deadly than the atom bomb, more shattering. So here we find that this system is now operating in favor of the corporations. But until 1971, one of the resolutions of the Bretton Woods Agreement was that all of the currencies, which are fiat currencies now, would be pegged to the dollar. And the dollar, in turn, would be pegged to gold. So what had happened was that the fixed exchange rate by which all of the currencies were pegged to the dollar ensured that the US currency could be redeemed. The idea was it could be redeemed at $35 per ounce of gold. Now, very interestingly, when 1971 happened and Nixon was obviously fighting his war with Vietnam, in August the 15th, 1971, United States President Richard Nixon announced that the foreign-held US dollars, i.e. by the other nations, would no longer be convertible into gold, thus stripping away the last vestige of an international gold standard. So why did he do this? He did that because he needed money to create money to fight his war with Vietnam. And as a result, right, and this was prior to the end of a policy, because what the United States had done is that they had already passed a law by saying that citizens might no longer be allowed to redeem their cash in dollars for gold. But so they had passed this law already, and then they passed another law for other countries and governments in 1971. And so effectively from 1971, Nixon initiated the regime of free-floating currencies that continues to this day. So David Graeber notes that the consensus amongst historians is that Nixon had little choice. His hand was forced by the rising costs of the Vietnam War, one that, like all capitalist wars, had been financed by deficit spending. Although the United States was in possession of a large proportion of the world's gold reserves in its vaults in Fort Knox, most poorer countries, in contrast, kept their reserves in dollars. And so the immediate effect of Nixon's unpegging the dollar was to cause the price of gold to skyrocket. It hit a peak of about $600 an ounce in 1918. This had the effect of causing US gold reserves to increase dramatically in value. And the value of the dollar as denominated in gold plummeted. And so the result was what? A massive net transfer of wealth from poor countries, which lacked the gold reserves, to the rich ones, like United States and Great Britain, that maintained them. And so this kind of initiation in 1971 was to set into play much of the financial system that we see today. Now, effectively, all money today is fiat. It's created ex nihilo. It's created as bank credit most of the time. But we want to talk about what these types of monies are now, so we understand how most of the money is created. So now that there's no peg, even a peg, secondary peg through the dollar to gold, now that's no longer there. The world enters a historically unprecedented financial phase, right? Hernan Daly, who's an economist, terms this phase growth mania, because now that there's no peg, money just increases like anything. So before I go into how it increases, I want to talk about what modern money is, right? And so I want to reaffirm that what happened after 1971 is pretty much now where we are today in terms of how modern day banks create money. So effectively, there are three types of money. There is what's known as cash. Now, most of us would associate that with physical money. So either it could be notes printed by the government, or it could be coins manufactured by, in the case of Bank of England, Royal Mint, right? And so this money is, it varies from country to country, but in the case of England, and this is generally how it is across most countries, that it makes up about 3% of the total money supply. So what we take to be money in terms of that physical stuff, the stuff that you put in your wallet, so the coins, this is created by the government, and this is directly created out of nothing. So this is government created money, and it makes up about 3%. Now we have the rest of the money is what you'd call digital money, right? That which is electronically transferred. And that is of two types. The first type is what we call central bank reserves. Now this type of money will never come to the public directly, this type of digital money. This is a money that is created by the central bank, and it is used directly to support the commercial banks that make up the banking infrastructure, right? So if we go to a previous slide that I was showing here. So the central bank here will create this money, right? And it will support these banks who make up the banking infrastructure of a country. Now, members of the public and normal businesses do not access central bank reserves. What they do is they are given to each of the banks. The commercial banks will hold a bank account, right? The central bank. And they basically allow, they further lending by these banks. So when they come in as reserves, this gives these banks more assets, and I'll discuss how that happens here. So the modern banking system. So what happened is, let's say this is a central bank, right? This is the central bank, and this is actually, these diagrams is taken from a Bank of England circular, which discusses specifically how money creation happens in the modern economy. So if you just type in Bank of England circular, money creation in the modern economy 2014, Q1, you'll get their special paper on that, and they discuss how money creation happens. And the way it happens in England is the way it happens everywhere. So basically, a central bank obviously creates money out of nothing. So it creates what's known as base money. This is money that only exists between banks, the commercial banks and the central bank. So it forwards, it creates money, which could be either in the form of giving hard cash to commercial banks or creating reserves. As soon as this arrives in a commercial bank, to the degree that this is created, this becomes a deposit that they have, right? And the commercial bank, because of this deposit, it has the ability now to create new deposits. This is what's known as the fractional reserve banking system. But whether or not they have reserves, some countries don't have reserves, they still are bound by certain ratios that they need to keep. And so this is how this basic works. So when they have these deposits, they can give new loans to people, right? So they give, the consumers come and they get new loans literally created whenever consumers wish to go into debt. These new loans in turn create new deposits. And so this cycle continues, right? And so what happens is commercial bank money, which is a third type of money that exists within commercial banks, this is what makes up 97% of the money in the economy. And this is nothing but when banks lend, right? Every time somebody needs something, money, they come there, they literally type in, you know, the person has to sign a contract, obviously, for a loan or a debt, and agreeing to pay back more money at a future date. Now this contract becomes an asset in the bank. This loan contract becomes an asset in the bank. And in lieu of that contract, the bank is able to type in money as a debt. That becomes a loan. And this money appears in the customer's bank account, right, as digits, but really this is what we know as bank credit. It is an IOU that's been extended in lieu of the customer paying back more in the future date. And that more is the interest account, is the interest on that debt. So this money is in electronic form, and it's known by various names. So 97% of this money is known by, we call it bank deposit, some people call it demand deposits, time deposits, bank liabilities, bank credit. But this is how most of money exists today. So now what you have to understand is our banking system has institutionalized interest. Money only comes into existence as a debt when someone agrees to pay back more, i.e. that interest. And this has a host of consequences. So now we're going to cover what these consequences are. If we understand that modern money only comes into existence as interest-bearing debt, that is, it only comes into existence when someone promises to pay back more of it, right? That means that if there's more, that at any one stage, there is more money owed back to the banks, the commercial banks, than what actually exists, right? And so there is more money in the economy than what exists. Now, how will all of this money be paid back? If too much of it's paid back, the money disappears, and we find that there isn't enough money. There is a recession. And if the banks then continually create too much, then there'll be too much of these digits that understood money, and these money, and this that is understood to be money, and this money ultimately has to go and be used for goods and services, right? So it creates an inflation in the price of the goods and services, which is problematic for those people who already own most of the goods and services. So most of the rulers and the leaders and shakers in this economy wouldn't want too much inflation. And so we understand now that the only thing stopping banks from creating and countries from creating too much money is this balancing act between these two extremes, constantly seeking. They have to grow, because if they don't continually growing, then there'll be a recession and they'll collapse because there isn't enough money to pay off the debts. But at the same time, they can't grow too much, because if they grow too much, then they will cause inflation. So all countries are trapped in this thing of seeking non-inflationary growth. Right. So how does that work out? I want to revisit what I just said, that at any point, the money owed back to the banks is greater than the money actually in existence in the economy. This money that owes back to the banks is known as a default risk, right? Because if more money is not created, then somebody has to lose their money for this money to be paid back. And this is an inbuilt model of scarcity in the economy. This is a zero-sum game, we call it, whereby the banks benefit at the expense of someone else. And so to prevent this from happening, there has to be a growth imperative, enough growth to prevent the default risk. This is known as the debt trap. So here's just exactly what I was trying to say. Too much money is created, this causes inflation. If too much is paid off, this causes recession. Fiscal policy, financial policy of nations is turned into a balancing act between these two extremes, constantly seeking non-inflationary economic growth. But what is it that can grow forever? Nothing can grow forever, right? If we look at the universe and everything, most things go to a point of some kind of peak, and then they kind of taper off. And this is the nature of the universe, where there is this kind of a nature of things eventually reaching a point when they decay. And so if we are constantly growing and we only have a limited number of assets that can be used for this, then we end up in the trap of what usury has done. So to recap much of what we've discovered already in the course of this presentation is that from 1694, when the first central bank was created and the fractional reserve banking existed, and there was a joint stock company started coming into being, then we find this kind of understanding, right, whereby money is no longer a commodity. It is seen as the total sum of banks' assets, loans, itself a debt. And this becomes the fueling drive, this imperative of growth becomes the fueling drive for what's called the Great Western Transmutation. What was it that made Western Europe ascend above most of the world? And Ian Ferguson discusses this, and it's called the Great Western Transmutation. I love this term because it was used by, I think, many historians, one of them, my favorite being Marshall G. Hodgson in his book, The Venture of Islam, and he's got a whole chapter dedicated to this. And he speaks about how there was kind of these technicalist kind of innovations that were happening in the West, and primarily them being financial. And that's very interesting because Niall Ferguson also says the same thing, that the great industrial revolution of the West that begins to happen around about this time cannot have happened if it wasn't preceded by the financial innovation that we see here, because that is what provides, in Adam Smith's words, a wagon full of air. Money has now become just something you can create. And what was paradoxical was the one country that lagged behind in this great Western transmutation, namely the Spanish countries of Spain and Portugal, were the countries that prior to this were the ones that were full of the influx of gold, because they were the ones that discovered the gold in the New World. But now their gold, which ended up mostly, as David Graeber touches upon, in partly in India, and much of the silver ends up in China. But they become lagging behind because they didn't create this kind of banking system. So this great Western transmutation funds a lot of the innovative other projects that are happening. And of course, the use of the steam in terms of the Industrial Revolution and so on, and the great infrastructure requirements are funded by this new growing economy. And in a more sinister way, this goes into the colonialist project. And then sinisterly, it starts revolving around, and it's always around these joint stock corporations. And joint stock corporations are basically this kind of ultimate body that becomes manufactured for the simple reason of maximizing growth, right? Its entire remit is to maximize growth. And, there's some interesting books. There's a book by Joel Bakken on this about the pathological pursuit of profit of corporations. Very famously, economists such as Milton Friedman actually touched upon how at the end of the day, a company has only, he famously said that there is but one social responsibility for corporations: to make as much money for their shareholders as possible. And this is a moral imperative. Executives who choose social and environmental goals over profits are in fact immoral. So there cannot be within the paradigm of a corporation with its anonymous shareholders who basically make up its owners, but basically have no other imperative other than maximization of profits, right? So it's become the ultimate representation of what? Of this growth imperative that money has, right? So I mentioned Joel Bakken. Joel Bakken's an interesting person. You should read his book, The Corporation, The Pathological Pursuit of Profit and Power. He presents a series of striking examples to support this argument, including how many corporations that we know and think are really friendly, but they use child labor in sweatshops across the world. They deliberately use pollutants that, if they can get away with it, they'll do it. Disturbing incidences where potential human fatalities are factored in as part of global corporations' cost-benefit analysis. You think, this is the sweet Nestle, but Nestle was well aware that much of its materials were cancer causing, but they were happy to push that in the quote unquote third or developing world, right? And so David Corton defines a corporation as what? He says a pool of money with special legal rights and protections dedicated to self-reproduction. Only the money which the corporate officers are legally bound to serve has rights. Management's real focus is on the money, not the shareholders. In effect, they are hired by money to nurture its growth and reproduction, even at the expense of life. And so this is now that logic of riba. Riba is what? We said growth. But it's not any growth. It's growth for the sake of growth. It's a destructive growth. Allah says, Yamhaqullahu riba. Allah destroys the growth of riba. But now it's become this perverse growth. And as it filters on today, we find this financialization of capital. Money itself, as it increases, it ultimately has to cannibalize itself. What does that mean? With so much money increasing, right? What's increasingly being bought and sold on the stock market is money for money. Because as we covered in post-1971, we said that what happens is that this growth mania stuff kicks in. And Charles Eisenstein writes in his book, Sacred Economics, he says, the credit bubble that is blamed as the source of our current economic woes was not a cause of them at all, but only a symptom. When returns on capital investment began to fail, this money begins a desperate search for other ways to maintain its expansion. When each bubble pops, be it commodities or real estate investments or dot-com stocks or real estate and financial derivatives in the 2000s, money starts looking on for the next bubble, only to maintain, all with the intent to maintain the illusion of economic expansion, the illusion of economic growth. And so we find this money growing so we have these major markets, the bond market, the stock market, the insurance market, the property markets. And in all of these things, what happens? The system goes on and resolves itself into a shadow banking system. Much of what was being bought and sold is the securitization for further buying and selling, the globalization of financial flows. No one knows what's really happening. So in the 2009 banking bill that was brought about in England, the Earl of Caithness spoke about how money is increasing. And she said that the UK money supply has grown from 31 billion in 1971. Here is the example. 31. So this is the money supply until 1971. right? Okay, it's increasing. This is the commercial bank created money. We know they're moving away, but until this point, there's still a gold peg, right? Here's 1971 onwards. We have to apply a different scale because it just goes on. Look at that polarization. And this is the financial crash, so it kind of recalibrates itself. But from 1971 onwards, she says, UK money supply has grown from 31 billion in 1971, when President Nixon closed the gold window, to in excess of 1,700 billion today. Let us consider the implications of those last two figures. They mean that every year since 1971, the banking system has created on average for its own use in excess of 44 billion. That's a yearly amount. This means that per year, right, the amount that's created of money in the money supply has been more than the entire history of money supply until 1971, right? Right. Until 1971, it's 31 billion. And now the yearly growth is averaged up to 44 billion, which means the yearly supply is more. And so think about this. Until 1971, this entire money supply had sustained our economy since recorded history and through 2 global world wars. But now it's just gone crazy. This is what Herman Daly calls growth mania. And so David Graeber says this new financialization of capital, right, meant that most of the money being invested was completely detached from any relation to production of commerce at all, but had become pure speculation. And that's why this speculation, which is now what calls someone like Bernard Lietaer to say that according to the International Monetary Fund, between 1970, once again, that 1970 mark, and 2010, there were 145 banking crises, 208 monetary crashes, 72 sovereign debt crises. In other words, a staggering total of 425 systemic banking crises, an average of more than 10 per year. These crises have hit more than 3/4 of the 180 countries that are members of the IMF, and many of them being hit several times. What this is telling us is this boom and bust is inbuilt in the system of money. And now, because they're looking for new markets, then what happens? These countries start looking for new ways they can trade. And that's why much of what's been bought and sold today is just positions on money. It's more akin to a global casino than actual trade. Right, actual trade. And then there's this constant search for new generation trade deals, right? The US and the Europe entered into something called the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, and we already, and Canada and Europe entered into CETA, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. But these kind of global legal systems start emerging whereby one country can literally take over the other countries, irrelevant of what their local regulation says. And you should read the writings of George Monbiot on this. He's very important, George Monbiot, because he talks about how, for example, looking at NAFTA as an example, Canada's democratic governments have continually lose cases to US corporations as carcinogenic chemicals in petrol have been justified, and the ecological devastation of Canada's quarries have been continued unabated on the premise that if they were to be challenged, this would be an obstacle to trade. So multilateral trade deals are being used to undermine the sovereignty of people across the world, of their parliament and of their laws, all in favor of this insane growth of money, this favor of corporate profit. So now we come to a very interesting thing. This, you know, I wanted, before I go, I'm going to go back to shadow banking. The shadow banking system now, which is basically what happens through securitization. Securitization is the financial practice whereby all of these debts that accrue are basically pooled together, and they're sold so that investors can fund more debt. Right? And so these 4 markets that you see, bond, stock, insurance, properties, they are now interconnected through securitization into the financial shadow banking system. The shadow banking system is made up of hedge funds, money market funds, investment banks, pension funds. All of these are usually lightly regulated, right? But they are the underpinning of the financial system. No one knows how much is the shadow banking, because that's why it's called short shadow. It symbolizes collectively the failure of the financial system, because it demonstrates the money madness that has engendered a spirit of just this kind of casino type insider trading, right? And so being although it feeds off a regulated system, being unregulated, some people estimate it between 70 trillion, others estimate it between 100 trillion. Some say it's 30, some say it's more than 50% of the world's estimated total money supply. And so a scholar such as Richard Heinberg then says, this insane idea of monetary growth, till when and at what cost? What cost? This is the destructive nature of riba. This is what Allah said, Yamhaqullahu riba. Allah will destroy usury. Right? Richard Heinberg says growth is over. This growth, because all of this money that's circulating has to go into something. And what is it leading to? It's leading to resource depletion. It's depleting the resources. It's leading to environmental degradation, and it's leading to systemic financial and monetary failure. As Eisenstein says, there is little more we can convert to money. Technological progress and refinements to industrial needs will not take more fish from the sea. The fish are mostly gone. They will not help us increase the timber harvest. The forests are already stressed to capacity. They will not allow us to pump more oil. The reserves are drying up. We cannot expand the service sector. There are hardly any things we can do for each other that we don't pay for already. There is no more room for economic growth as we have known it. There is no more room for the conversion of life and the world into money. Like a boiling planet, vanishing cropland, extreme poverty, and then pending shortages of fresh water, oil, and other natural resources, there is little left that we can use to supply the growth machine. And so we ask this question. This is an important question posed by Gustav Speth. He says, what can we do? Because like an addict, we have to find a way of redesigning the world economy such that we have a world left. So now I'm calling you to the Quranic verse. And this is when we find this verse come to life, this Quranic verse come to life, that Allah speaks about riba. Allah says in the Quran, He says, الذين يأكلون الربا لا يقومون إلا كما يقوم الذي يتخبطه الشيطان من المس. He says what? Right? He says, sorry, I'm actually reading a Quranic verse, but I think this is something we're probably going to do in the next presentation. So I'm actually going to go back and read this in the next presentation, but I just want to talk about what this is. This has become the logic of interest, has become the logic of an addict. It assumes always and forever we can continue to supplement or meet this innate urge to continue to have more and more and more. And eventually this bankrupts the person, bankrupts his family, bankrupts his relationships, and this is what interest is doing. Another analogy of interest is what Edward Abbey said. He said the logic of interest is the logic of the cancer cell. It operates like it thinks it can grow continually, and as the cancer cell grows, but what does the cancer cell do? It cannibalizes its very host, the very person it's with. And this is what our monetary system is doing. It's cannibalizing the world and our relationships. And that's why Allah says, فَأْذَنُوا بِحَرْبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. Beware of a war from God against this system, because it's literally riba, interest, is the means of polarization and separation in this world. And so I'll end here this presentation. I'll end by saying that the Prophet ﷺ narrates, he said, عن أبي هريرة أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال, he said, يأتي على الناس زمان يأكلون فيه ربا. He said the time will come when people will consume riba en masse. قال قيل له الناس كلهم. And it was said, is that all of the people? And the Prophet ﷺ said, من لم يأكله منهم ناله منه بارح. That someone who doesn't eat from this, someone who doesn't directly take this, will be someone who will be afflicted by its dust. And this is what a prediction of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, that we live in a time when through the financial systems and the global architecture and the very nature by which money comes into existence today, that it has imprisoned us in this dynamic of perpetual growth. And it has imprisoned us in this dynamic of cancerous growth in our relationships, and money being the common conduit to all our various areas of societal connection, be it education, be it healthcare. We find time and time again that logic of the corporation, that logic of maximizing profits, that logic of destruction taking over our lives. And so the question becomes, how do we remove this dust? And how do we see? Well, the only way you can remove dust is you see it. Then you know how to remove it. And so the next and final presentation will be looking at and removing the dust of riba. And with this, we come to the end of this presentation. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Subhanak wa bihamdik. Subhana al-azim wal asr. Inna al-insana fi khusr. Illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihati. Wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr.